Welcome, everyone. So excited that you've decided to join us today in our next installation of our coffee break webinar, 5 Best Practices for Hiring the Right Evaluation Partner. Before we get started, let me go over a couple of housekeeping items. And it's really important that you have the opportunity to ask questions, so make sure to use the question function on your computer to be able to do that. And as always, we have Elise Hopes, our outreach coordinator, with us today, helping to moderate the Q&A as well as addressing any computer issues you may have. And if you don't know me, let me introduce myself. I'm Lana Rux, the principal consultant with the Rux Group. And the Rux Group is a research and evaluation firm that gathers, analyzes, and interprets data to enable our clients to measure the impact of their work. We were formed in 2008, and over the past 12 years, we've worked with primarily higher education institutions and grants funded by federal agencies such as the National Science Foundation, Department of Education, and Department of Labor, as well as foundation-funded work. So to create the context or set the stage for our conversation today, I want to talk about some elements that I think makes hiring an evaluator challenging. And this is from the evaluator's perspective of things that I've seen. I think one element that makes hiring an evaluator really challenging is just maneuvering through the contracting process. If you're familiar at all with program evaluation, you will understand that kind of securing the resources of an securing the services of an evaluator is really different than purchasing a pen. It's a really different type of relationship. But that the contracting process sometimes really doesn't map onto the type of relationship that you'll have ultimately with an evaluator. So I think that's one challenging piece. Another challenging piece could just be that the project team doesn't have a lot of experience or knowledge around evaluation. And so there's not a lot of understanding of what they even should be expecting in working with an evaluator. And thirdly, there's no certifying organization for evaluators. Unlike if you're looking for an accountant, you would know to look for a CPA, for a certified public accountant. And for evaluators, really anyone can hang out a shingle and call themselves an evaluator. So it's really hard to be able to tease apart the individuals who have the skills to be able to really effectively serve as an evaluator. And then the final element that I've seen to be really a challenge is in regards to the project team doesn't even know until very late within the process that even need an evaluator. And even if those aren't challenges, let's say that you know that you need an evaluator and you go in Google and you enter in program evaluator, you're not going to get a list of people who do program evaluation. What you're going to get instead is information about jobs in program evaluator. So I think all of those together really helps to create the reason why we wanted to have a webinar talking about the hiring process. And so during our time together, what we're really hoping to be able to do is a couple of things. Provide some best practices on selecting and working with an evaluator. And towards the end of the webinar, I'm going to highlight some additional resources that you can cross-reference. And so thinking about those resources and as a backdrop of those resources, what I'm trying to do too in the webinar, we'll try to bring to life some of the recommendations that are highlighted in those resources and how best to be able to go through the selection process. And then also what's really important to us and important to me in particular, just because I'm facilitating here today, is just in regards to what I think is really important about focusing in on the hiring process is that it really lays the foundation for a really great working relationship with an evaluator. And if you've seen any of our previous webinars, we talk a lot about the continuous improvement process, because from our perspective, evaluation isn't conducted just to check a box. It's conducted to really try to provide value to the implementation process of a project. And then also what you probably have seen throughout our webinars is that we all are always trying to reduce the angst around evaluation. So in this context, this time, we want to reduce the angst around hiring and working with an evaluator. And of course, we want to answer your questions too, so make sure to use that chat function. So with that as context, let's go ahead and jump in and talk about what the first best practice is. And the first best practice that we want to share is really about starting the process early so that allows the evaluator a time for you to select and actually onboard an evaluator. And in some ways, that really seems slightly self-evident, but there are times where you can get really compressed and not able to uh, have the extended amount of time to be able to choose an evaluator, and that's what we want to be able to prevent. So let me give you a couple examples. So very often people will reach out and ask if we're interested in serving as an external evaluator. And here's an example of that from Compressed for Time. And so we'll have a little bit of back and forth, and I'll ask, what type of decision that you make on the evaluator. And sometimes I get this type of response, which is, we'll go with your firm because you were the first to respond. Now, I think in this context that they have lucked upon a really great evaluator who will provide some really great insights and recommendations throughout the process. And I completely understand how you can get compressed for time, because writing a proposal is very much like building the plane and flying it at the same time. And that can be utterly challenging. But we all would admit that this is not the ideal situation in terms of how to select an external evaluator. And that the criteria shouldn't be around how responsive someone is. And that means sometimes we will win a contract and sometimes we don't. Here's another example. Something like this happened where they said, thank you for a response. We heard from another evaluator, so we decided to go with that group. And so again, we don't want time to be the criteria. So we want to start thinking about how do we function and operate early within the process so that doesn't happen. And so early is really relative to the stage of the grant life cycle. And so let's talk a little bit about the life cycle, and then what can you do at each of those stages that are a little bit on the early side so that you won't be in that compressed time, or you won't be in need someone now position. So conceptually, I kind of think of the life cycle of a grant in this way. You have your idea generation, funding search, proposal development, award management, and award closeout. I think of award closeout as a little bit different than award management. To me, award management in that phase, you can still make changes around the grant. You can still impact on the evaluation and make some changes in that regards too. But when you get to award closeout, you're just have less options in the types of changes that you can make. And so you probably will have to just go in a direction with the evaluation, and you have to go in the direction of the data that you have. So that's why I conceptually tease those apart. So during the idea generation phase, some of the things that you can do is, one, start gathering names of evaluation entities. And so if you come across an evaluation report, just jot that name down. If you talk to other principal investigators or project directors, ask them who they're using as an evaluator and just start to create a list in that regard. The other thing that you can do too, even though you're in an idea generation, if you come across some names, conduct an informational interview. And this could be the case particularly if you don't have a lot of familiarity with program evaluation. And most evaluators will be really agreeable to just having a conversation and really just being able to answer the questions and help to give some information about their philosophy around evaluation. And moving to the funding search, there are a couple of things that you can do here as well. One, you can start thinking about the evaluator project team relationship, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. But the other suggestion that I would offer is that when you're starting to look at different funding sources and trying to make decisions if what you want to accomplish in a project or initiative aligns with that funding source, also make sure to search for the requirements for the evaluation. So here's an example of that. This is a solicitation for the Community and People Grant for Research Hub for the National Science Foundation. And what you can do is just pull up that solicitation and do a search on the evaluation or evaluator, and you'll find a couple of really key pieces of information. And this is really important too because solicitations really have varied expectations and how much information you should have about the evaluation and about the evaluator. So in this situation, you would be expected to actually have the external evaluator named. But in some solicitations, you don't need to have the evaluator named during the proposal phase. And in this situation, you also need to have a detailed evaluation plan. And again, some solicitations, that's not necessarily required to have as much detail on that component. So as you're starting to do searches around grant sources, also make sure that you just become aware and start looking to see if there are any requirements around the evaluation. And then next, during the proposal development phase, you want to, if you can, and we'll get to this later too in regards to how you actually procure an evaluator, you want to, in an ideal situation, involve the evaluator in developing the proposal. And again, ideally, you want to be able to give the evaluator some leadway that you will be reaching out or that you'll be giving them a proposal narrative. So just giving them some information that the proposal narrative will be coming is important, even if it may be several weeks before that narrative is actually complete. And the benefit of giving them a heads up around that is so that they can make sure that they're clearing out space and they have capacity to be able to respond to the request. And then during the award management phase, if you did identify someone in the solicitation, then you want to make sure to reach out to them as quickly as possible. I know with some of the grants, they are publicly announced, so sometimes we will look and search to see if the grants that we were a part of were actually awarded, so then we can do a reach out very quickly. And other times we're just not aware of that, and the project will be probably aware before we are. And again, just to let that evaluator know that it was actually awarded so they can start thinking about the implementation and so you can start working together very quickly. And if you don't have someone identified, then you can go ahead and begin the procurement process right away so that early within the grant life, you have an evaluator who's on the team. And then during your work closeout, if you are in need of an evaluator, and there are so many different reasons why you could be in need of an evaluator. It could be that you weren't able to secure someone earlier. Sometimes something happens to the current evaluator and you need to replace them. But some of the things that you can do to help in the early part of that is just make sure that you're communicating the time sensitive nature of the work so that that evaluator will understand that they will need additional capacity to be able to complete the necessary tasks. And then also just ensure that there's alignment in the scope of work with the closeout expectations. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there for a minute and ask Elise if there are any questions that have emerged.
Hi, Lana, we do have a question. If people come to you late, do you work with them or do you tell them no?
I definitely will work with individuals even if they are coming to me on the late side. I think that I have a tendency to have a lot of mercy in this process because I know that trying to find individuals, making recommendations, trying to find someone who's reputable can be challenging. So if they're coming to me on the late side, and late sometimes is pretty close to when I need to get something turned around. So we will do our best if we have the capacity, but we will not just outright necessarily say no, but we would like to really make sure that we still have some time to give some feedback on the narrative, and that there's a narrative that's nearly complete so that we can help with the finalization of that piece.
Thanks, Lana. That's all for now.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's go on to the next best practice. And the next best practice is to write up what you would like to see in the evaluation. And I should say within this, when I say write out what you would like to see in evaluation, I'm not talking about necessarily a formal document. I'm not talking about a treatise. I'm just talking about jotting down what your thoughts would be about working with another individual, another consultant. And this can be a very informal process that you do just with yourself, or maybe the project team does this. This is not intended as a formal exercise. And even more so, you don't have a lot of experience with an evaluator, but you do have experience working with people. And so I think this is an important step to help just start to understand what you personally may want in terms of working with an evaluator. So you just start simply with the question, what do I want out of the evaluation? How would I like to work with an evaluator? And in response to that, you may say you want somebody who's really knowledgeable about the evaluation and that they can help to use the evaluation in terms of the implementation of the project, or that you want somebody who really understands the context in which you're operating in and really understands the nature of your program. And then you may have some other things that just would be really nice. It would be nice if that person could help in terms of making changes along the way to how to evaluate the project, or make recommendations in terms of implementation. Or it could be just in regards to how responsive you want the person to be. And so that, I think, is an important exercise for a number of reasons, but it's also important because when you look at some of the resources that I suggest, they will talk about having to make a decision on if you're going to work with an external evaluator or an internal evaluator. And you'll see that terminology come up too when you look at solicitations. So in terms of what is an external and internal evaluator, again, this varies a little bit by solicitation and by funding program, but in general, an external evaluator is going to be someone who's not a part of the organization, or who's at the organization but is not considered a part of the chain of command. They're not working directly on the project. Right? And then an internal evaluator is going to be the converse. They're going to be someone who could be at the institution. Again, some solicitations may consider a person at the institution an evaluator unless certain structures are put in place, or that they are part of that chain of command. They're actually a part of the project team. And so before you start making a decision on, do you need an external, internal evaluator, I think that previous exercise will really help you. And so then you can take that information, and be able to create a grid around the types of characteristics that you would like to have. And then you can say, well, who will have those components that are important to you and your project? And so you can start building something out of this nature that around the types of skills that they have, the way that they're going to approach the evaluation, and what's also important too, if it's meeting the requirements for an external evaluator. And that process will help you to decide if you need an external or an internal evaluator. Then the next best practice is in regards to becoming familiar with the organizational procurement requirements. And so one of the things that I have found is that there's really a lot of variability in the contracting process across organizations. And that variability doesn't always land in regards to the size of the organization, whether it's private or public. Just from my own personal experience, I think that some of that has to do with the experience of the institution and working with an evaluator. And as we kind of talked about before, that the evaluation relationship's a little bit different in terms of the procurement and different in terms of being able to work together. And so understandably, there's differences in how to approach that depending on that type of experience. So let me just give some highlights in terms of the different types of processes or different types of approaches. One could be a sole source, and a sole source is when there is not a bid and that an individual has been identified as the only entity that can actually provide the services or deliverables. And I should note too that for federal funded initiatives, they're guided by the common guidance, and common guidance actually does allow for sole source contracting, but that's going to be dependent on the policies of the institution. Another approach that's been quite popular too is through a pre-qualifications approach. So to be able to meet the demands of needing to go quickly with an evaluation, schools will create a pool of evaluators who are already vetted, who already have demonstrated that they are qualified, and either they will sole source that project to someone on that list or a bid will go out. And then there's also a competitive bid process that can occur. We're actually requesting a formal proposal from individuals to be able to serve as an evaluator on a project. Now, you want to know this kind of early in the process because the organizational procurement processes are going to influence how you interact with a potential evaluator. You want them to know if you reach out to them, if they help you with the evaluation, are they going to be written to the grant or are they going to have to make a bid on the project after the award? So having some knowledge, whether that's going to your back office support or talking to the grant office, just about what that procurement process is will really make you feel a lot more comfortable in interacting with the evaluator. Then also, the next best practice is that when you're actually interviewing or making the selection process, I think that it's really beneficial to not only have an interview, but also have a written document and vice versa. And that makes you sure that you have both of those pieces. So when you talk about a written document, I think you get really different types of information than you get through an interview. And in a written document, you're getting really fundamental information. And what do I mean by written document? It could be a quote, it could be a proposal, but it could just be a statement of qualifications or something that really just some elements to explain pieces about the evaluation. And I'll go into that in a moment. Whereas an interview, you're gathering slightly different information. It's more about information about how you're actually going to work together. And again, with evaluation, the rapport that you have with the evaluator is really key and really important. So an interview or conversation really helps to give you a sense of what it would be like to work with this person. So from a written document, some of the things that you may find, get information about the individual or the firm. You'll get some previous evaluation experience, and then you'll also get information about the scope of work and the budget. And from the scope of work, you may also get information about how frequently you're going to engage with the evaluator, as well as what types of deliverables that you'll expect from the person, which is really important to be able to put that in context with the budget. Value is going to come not by what the bottom line or the top line number of the budget is, but that relative piece of how much engagement, how much consultation, and the deliverables that are going to be provided. And during an interview or conversation, you'll be able to get a little more information about their evaluation philosophy, get more information about their approach to work. And then also, I think what's really key are the types of questions that the evaluator can ask too. I think that those questions can be really informative. And this type of dialogue will help both parties really understand if working together is a good fit. So I'm going to go ahead and pause there and see if there are any other questions.
Yes, our next question is, what advice do you have if one is required to have a detailed evaluation plan but can't name the evaluator? I'm concerned that we would be developing a relationship with an evaluator in a pre-award development, but need to transition their work to someone else for implementation of the project after the procurement process is complete.
So it sounds like there may be two components to that. So if it's the case, there are situations in which the person who's developing the proposal cannot be involved in the evaluation. And I think that's a really different type of relationship. You may, I think at the end of the day, you just want to be very transparent about that. There could be, if that's the case, where a person can only be involved in the proposal development and they cannot be involved in the evaluation piece, then again, transparency and seeing if that person can actually be compensated just on that piece of it. If the situation is that they could be involved in both elements, but that they would have to do a bid, then again, transparency and just allow that person to make that decision if they want to help or if they don't want to help. But those are a couple of different options that you can take. Is just go ahead and contract out just that evaluation piece and ask for some consultation on that, knowing that they can't be in the back end. And those are things that we've done. We've done that as well. So that's a really good question. And I'm going to go quickly now through the last point in the last couple of slides here too. So the final one is just periodically reevaluate what you would like to see in the evaluation. So like we said at the beginning, you can ask yourself questions, but then ask yourself that question after having a year of experience. What would you like to see in the evaluation and who you're working with? And so a suggestion around the award management piece is to ask yourself some of these questions. Like I said, what would you like to know? Have an initial review with the evaluator to talk about some of these things in terms of what you've seen or what you haven't seen. And then something else that you may want to do if you're having a new relationship with an evaluator, consider just a 1-year contract with them so that you both would have potentially a graceful way of exiting. But I should say, if you do that, make sure that you're constantly talking to your evaluator about the issues and the what you want to see out of the evaluation before you just, as the evaluator, I would appreciate that conversation. But I also know, and I've seen, I don't want someone who is not getting what they need out of evaluation to feel as though there's not an exit for them as well. And so just very quickly, is there another question there, Elise?
Those are all the questions for now.
Okay, perfect. The resources here, these, if you go back to our website or in a couple of days, this recording will be posted. You'll have access to some resources I think that will be really helpful for you. And then also, join us for our next Coffee Break webinar series, where we're really excited to have the project director for Central State University's STEM Success Center, who are going to talk about program evaluation in practice and really talk about how program evaluation has helped them in the decision making process and in the evolution of their grant implementation. So, as always, thank you so much for joining us today. If there is a question that you didn't share, please make sure to reach out to us so that I can answer those questions. That's never a burden. I really appreciate being able to do that. Thank you and have a great rest of the day.